Welcome friends to tonight's journey through history. In this series we'll step into the life of Ivan the Terrible, Russia's first Tsar. His story is filled with triumph, tragedy and shadows that shaped a nation. We'll begin with his childhood, a time of loneliness and turmoil that would define the man he became. If you enjoy relaxing history told in a calm, soothing way, I'd love for you to subscribe and join me as we uncover more tales from the past. Now, let's begin with Chapter 1. The year was 1530, and Moscow was buzzing with a strange mix of hope and dread. The Kremlin walls, tall and imposing, guarded a city that was still more wooden than stone, more smoke than marble. Inside those walls, on August 25th, a baby's cry echoed through the chambers. His name was Ivan, son of Grand Prince Vasily III of Moscow. The boy's arrival was a big deal. Russia needed a strong heir to keep the princes and boyaries in line. But little did anyone know, this child would grow into a man remembered as both a builder and a destroyer, a pious ruler and a merciless tyrant. Ivan's father, Vasily III, wasn't exactly the warm and fuzzy type. He was the kind of man who saw politics as a never-ending chess game, and he wasn't afraid to sacrifice a few pawns if it meant protecting the king. But fate didn't give him much time to play. Only 3 years after Ivan was born, Vasily fell ill, and in a time without modern medicine, that usually meant the worst. By the time Ivan was old enough to notice the cold draft in the Kremlin halls, his father was gone. The throne of Moscow now belonged to a toddler who barely understood how to hold a spoon, let alone an empire. When a ruler dies and leaves behind a child, you can bet the vultures start circling. Enter the boyars, the powerful noble families of Russia. Imagine them like Game of Thrones houses, but with more fur hats and fewer dragons. These men had long resented the tight grip of the Moscow princes, and now, with little Ivan as heir, they saw an opportunity. Ivan's mother, Elena Glinskaya, was supposed to act as regent, but she had her own enemies. She was accused of everything from corruption to witchcraft because, well, when you're a woman ruling in a man's world, people tend to throw around wild accusations. Elena, though, wasn't someone you could easily push around. For 5 years she managed to hold the regency together. She signed treaties, fortified defenses, and kept the wolves at bay. But in 1538, when Ivan was only 8 years old, she suddenly died. Poison, many whispered. After all, sudden deaths were rarely natural when politics was involved. With Elena gone, Ivan and his little brother Yuri were left at the mercy of the boyars. And mercy, it turned out, wasn't really their strong suit. The Kremlin, once Ivan's home, became more like a prison. The boyars treated him less like a prince and more like an annoying nephew who overstayed his welcome. He was often neglected, sometimes even bullied. One moment he was dining in splendor, the next he was left scrounging for scraps. Servants who were loyal to him were dismissed or beaten. This mix of privilege and abuse left young Ivan with a strange outlook on life. He was both the center of the Russian world and a powerless child at the mercy of cruel guardians. To cope, Ivan turned inward. He devoured books, religious texts, chronicles of saints, and stories of kings. He loved the idea of power, but he also grew fascinated with cruelty. There are tales of him tossing animals from the Kremlin walls just to watch them fall. It was a twisted kind of entertainment for a child who had little control over his own fate. The boyars thought they were breaking him, but in reality, they were forging something darker, a ruler who would never forgive humiliation. Even in his isolation, Ivan understood one thing: fear was power. When he was ignored, he remembered it. When he was mocked, he burned it into his memory. When he was shown cruelty, he filed it away for later. These boyars thought they were dealing with a weak, broken child. Instead, they were raising a storm. One day, that boy would sit on a throne, and when he did, the nobles who laughed at him would not be laughing for long. After his mother's death, Ivan was no ordinary child. Imagine growing up inside the Kremlin, surrounded by golden icons and heavy wooden doors, yet never feeling safe. He lived among guards and courtiers, but trust was rarer than bread in a famine. Even when he laughed, there was a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, like he already knew the world was out to get him. Ivan found refuge in books. He read scripture, histories, and stories of saints who endured pain and came out strong. He admired kings and conquerors, imagining himself in their shoes. But here's the twist. Those books also taught him that power was sacred, that a ruler was chosen by God. That idea would stick with him forever. Of course, not everything he read was holy. Ivan had a cruel streak, and it started young. He would toss small animals from the Kremlin walls just to watch them suffer. It sounds grim, and it was, but it was also a way for him to feel in control when the boyars made him feel powerless. The boyars were supposed to guide him, but most treated him like a nuisance. They pushed him aside during feasts, mocked him, and sometimes left him hungry. When he was ignored, Ivan remembered. When he was humiliated, he remembered. And when he grew up, well, Let's just say the boyars would wish they'd been nicer babysitters. Loneliness became Ivan's constant companion. He had no real friends, only rivals. Even his younger brother Yuri, who was developmentally disabled, couldn't be a true ally. So Ivan walked the halls with no one to trust, storing up bitterness like a winter storehouse full of grain. Sometimes Ivan would lash out. He threw fits, smashed dishes, and yelled at servants. Other times he withdrew into silence, staring at the icons on the wall, as if waiting for God to answer. The mix of rage and piety made him unpredictable, even as a child. One lesson stuck deep in his mind: the boyars only respected fear. He saw how they bowed to power and mocked weakness. So Ivan began practicing cruelty the way other kids practice games. He wanted to be feared, because fear, he realized, was the only kind of loyalty he could count on. Despite the bullying, Ivan wasn't helpless. He had a sharp memory and sharper instincts. He watched the boyars carefully, who whispered with whom, who schemed against whom. Even as a child, he was learning the art of survival through observation. At night, Ivan would dream of power. He pictured himself not as a weak child, but as a crowned ruler with armies at his command. He saw himself bringing the boyars to their knees. Dreams like that can be dangerous, especially when the dreamer has the will to make them real. The boy who walked those Kremlin corridors in silence was already becoming the man who would terrify Russia. Every insult, every slight, every cruel laugh was fuel for the fire. Ivan wasn't just a lonely prince, he was a storm in the making. By the time Ivan was 16, he had seen enough betrayal and loneliness to fill several lifetimes. But now something new stirred in Moscow. The boy was about to become a man, and not just any man. He would be crowned Tsar, the first in Russian history. Not just a grand prince of Moscow, but Tsar of all Rus. The boy who once sat alone at empty feasts was about to sit on a throne that would shake the land. The year was 1547. Snow-blanketed Moscow, muffling the sound of bells and horses. Inside the Kremlin, the scene was entirely different. Chandeliers blazing, choirs chanting, incense thick in the air. This wasn't just a coronation, it was theatre. Ivan wasn't just putting on a crown, he was becoming something greater, something ordained by God. Until now, Russian rulers were called grand princes. But Ivan wanted something stronger, something with weight. He chose the title Tsar, drawn from the Roman Caesar. To Ivan, this made him not just a ruler of Russia, but heir to the legacies of Rome and Byzantium. No one had dared claim such a title before, but Ivan dared. In the Cathedral of the Dormition, the ceremony began. Priests chanted in deep, sonorous tones. The crowd of nobles and clergy leaned forward, knowing they were witnessing something entirely new. Ivan knelt before the altar, his young face lit by the flickering glow of countless candles. The moment was heavy with history. The Metropolitan of Moscow placed the monomax cap, the ancient crown, on Ivan's head. For centuries it had symbolized authority, passed from ruler to ruler, but now it became something greater. With this gesture, Ivan was no longer a boy. He was Tsar, chosen by God to rule all of Russia. The title of Tsar wasn't just fancy dressing. It meant power that stretched beyond the boyars, beyond the city of Moscow, beyond even the borders of Russia itself. Ivan wanted his rule to be seen as absolute, divine, and eternal. He wasn't playing at being a prince. He was stepping onto the stage of world empires. The boyars, of course, weren't thrilled. They had enjoyed years of bullying Ivan and pulling strings behind the throne. Now this young man was announcing that he alone held God's authority. But they had little choice. They bowed, smiled, and pretended loyalty, even as resentment festered in their hearts. Outside, the people of Moscow cheered. They didn't care much about politics, but they loved the spectacle. To them, Ivan was still a mystery, stern, serious, almost holy in demeanor. But they saw hope too, a strong ruler who might bring stability after decades of chaos. For a moment, the people and the throne were united. The coronation feast was grander than anything Moscow had ever seen. Tables groaned under roasted meats, fish, breads, and honey mead. Ivan sat at the head, silent but commanding, his eyes scanning the hall. It was no longer the boy ignored at the table. It was the Tsar, with everyone else beneath him. That day in January 1547 changed Russia forever. Ivan wasn't just crowned, he redefined kingship itself. From that moment on, Russia was not ruled by princes who negotiated with nobles. It was ruled by Tsars, men who believed themselves chosen by God. The lonely child of the Kremlin was now something far greater. Just months after his grand coronation, Ivan's new title was put to the test. In June 1547, Moscow was struck by disaster. A massive fire ripped through the wooden city, swallowing homes, shops, and even parts of the Kremlin itself. For a city built mostly of timber, it was like lighting a match in a haystack. The fire raged for days. Whole neighborhoods were reduced to ashes. People lost everything. livelihoods, families, even hope. Some said it was punishment from God. Others whispered that enemies had set the blaze. The young Tsar, still new to his throne, was suddenly staring down a crisis bigger than any feast or ceremony. When people lose homes, they also lose patience. Angry crowds needed someone to blame, and who better than the boyars? After all, they had ruled during Ivan's childhood, and most common folk believed their greed had cursed Moscow. Rumors spread that noble families had either caused or worsened the fire. The violence was shocking. Nobles were attacked in the streets. One high-ranking boyar, Yuri Glinsky, ironically related to Ivan's own mother, was torn apart by an enraged mob. It was like all the hatred bottled up during Ivan's boyhood had finally exploded, only now it was directed at the ruling elite. Ivan was just 17, but he saw the writing on the wall. The boyars couldn't protect themselves, let alone protect Moscow. If the throne was going to survive, he had to step forward, not as a boy struggling for scraps, but as a Tsar who controlled fire and fear alike. During this chaos, Ivan found his anchor in someone unexpected, his new wife Anastasia Romanovna. She was gentle, kind, and had a calming effect on him. Where others saw only fire and blood, Anastasia gave Ivan reason to believe he could be more than just a tyrant in waiting. Anastasia came from the Romanov family, yes, the very dynasty that would later rule Russia for 300 years. Their marriage brought Ivan both stability and powerful allies. For the first time, he had someone he truly trusted, someone who softened the sharp edges of his temper. The fire taught Ivan something crucial. Power wasn't just about crowns and titles. It was about being the one who restored order when everything burned. He began to see himself not just as Tsar in name, but as Tsar in action, the protector and punisher of Russia. Still, the trauma lingered. Ivan never forgot the sight of his capital in flames. Fire became a symbol in his mind: destruction, purification, and divine punishment. Later in life, he would use fire as a weapon, both literally and figuratively. To Ivan, the flames of 1547 were not just tragedy, they were a lesson. So out of ashes, a Tsar was reborn. The fire of Moscow was devastating, yes, but it also forged the iron will of Ivan. No longer just a lonely boy in the Kremlin, he now carried himself as a ruler who could endure disaster, and perhaps even use it to his advantage. After the fire, Ivan realized he couldn't rule Russia alone. He was young, ambitious, and full of energy, but he needed brains around him too. So he gathered a small group of advisors who actually cared about reform instead of just filling their pockets. They became known as the Chosen Council. Now don't let the name fool you. The Chosen Council wasn't chosen by God or angels. Ivan picked them himself. Men he trusted more than the greedy boyars. They weren't perfect, but compared to the backstabbing nobles, they were like a breath of fresh Moscow winter air. One of the stars of this team was Metropolitan Macarius, head of the Orthodox Church. He wasn't just a holy man, he was also clever, supportive, and surprisingly good at politics. Under his guidance, Ivan started to see himself less as a boy with a crown, and more as a Tsar with a divine mission. Another key figure was Alexei Adashev, a loyal administrator who became Ivan's right-hand man. While boyars schemed in dark corners, Adashev actually rolled up his sleeves and got things done. With men like him, Ivan began to dream big. The council pushed for major reforms. They helped Ivan create a new law code, the Sudebnik of 1550. This wasn't just dusty legal talk. It meant fairer taxes, stricter rules against corruption, and some protections for peasants. For a society used to chaos, this felt like progress. Military reform was also on the table. Ivan organized the Streltsy, the first standing army of musketeers in Russia. Instead of relying only on nobles and their private armies, Ivan now had professional soldiers loyal to the crown, muskets, fur hats, and red uniforms. The Streltsy looked sharp and meant business. The council also worked on local government. They introduced Zemsky Sobors, assemblies that let representatives from towns have a say in politics. Okay, it wasn't democracy as we know it, but for 16th century Russia it was groundbreaking. For a while it felt like Ivan was on the right path. He had stability at home, victories abroad, and a council that made him look wise. Even the boyars had to grit their teeth and admit, maybe this Tsar thing wasn't such a bad idea after all. But beneath the progress, shadows lingered. Ivan's paranoia never fully went away. He liked his council, yes, but he never forgot what it felt like to be bullied as a boy. Deep down, he knew loyalty could vanish like smoke. For now, though, the reforms rolled on. The Chosen Council marked the high point of Ivan's early reign. It showed that he could rule wisely, not just harshly. But history teaches us that good times don't last forever. For Ivan, this period was like a calm sunrise, soon to be followed by a storm. Ivan wasn't just building armies and rewriting law codes. He was also shaping himself as a man chosen by God. From the moment he took the crown, religion was not just faith for him, it was fuel. He believed his rule came directly from heaven, and he wanted everyone else to believe it too. His closest religious advisor was Metropolitan Macarius. This priest wasn't only pious, he was politically sharp. Together, Ivan and Macarius organized church councils to strengthen orthodoxy across Russia. To Ivan, every church built, every saint canonized, was proof that he was more than a ruler, he was God's Tsar. Ivan used the church to create unity. He pushed for a single Russian identity under one faith. With Macarius's help, he compiled lives of saints, making Russian history feel like a holy story, leading straight to his throne. Clever move, right? Mix politics with religion, and suddenly your crown shines brighter. He also built churches that left people speechless. The most famous, of course, was St. Basil's Cathedral, built to celebrate his conquest of Kazan. Its colorful domes looked like something out of a fairy tale, and it screamed, "This Tsar has God on his side." But Ivan's relationship with faith wasn't all sweetness and incense. He saw himself as holy, but also as the hand of divine punishment. If you disobeyed the Tsar, you weren't just crossing him, you were crossing God. That made his wrath feel righteous in his own mind. People noticed this blend of prayer and power. One moment Ivan was on his knees before an icon, whispering like a saint. The next he was ordering executions in the name of divine justice. To outsiders it felt confusing. To Ivan it made perfect sense. The boyars had to tread carefully, oppose Ivan, and suddenly your loyalty wasn't just questioned by the Tsar, it was questioned by heaven. And let's be honest, arguing with God is a hard case to win. So they bowed, kissed icons, and kept their doubts quiet. Ordinary people, meanwhile, were impressed. They saw Ivan fasting, praying, building churches, and defending orthodoxy. For peasants who longed for a protector, he looked like the perfect mix, part warrior, part monk. Faith gave Ivan confidence, but it also gave him excuses. Every harsh law, every campaign, every execution could be framed as God's will, and once you believe that your hand swings the sword of heaven, mercy doesn't come easily. By the end of these early years, Ivan had carved out an image, not just a Tsar, but God's Tsar. The church blessed his every move, the people admired his piety, and the boyar bit their tongues. Faith and authority had merged, and together they made him unstoppable, or so it seemed. By the mid-1500s, Ivan wasn't content with just ruling Moscow. He wanted to expand his realm, to push Russia beyond its old borders. His eyes turned east toward the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, remnants of the once mighty Golden Horde. If he could conquer them, the Volga River would be his highway, and Russia would suddenly feel much bigger. Kazan was the first target. Sitting on the banks of the Volga, it was a powerful Tatar fortress. For decades, Moscow and Kazan had fought back and forth, but now Ivan wanted to end the feud once and for all. To him, Kazan wasn't just a city, it was a statement. In 1552, Ivan led a massive army to Kazan. Thousands of soldiers marched under the Orthodox cross, carrying muskets, cannons, and banners. This wasn't some ragtag raid, this was a professional campaign. The boy who once threw scraps to animals was now commanding men by the tens of thousands. The siege of Kazan was brutal. Ivan brought heavy artillery, blasting the walls day after day. Engineers dug tunnels to plant explosives beneath the fortress. Every boom shook the city's defenders, while inside the Russian camp, priests held services to keep morale high. Faith and firepower marched hand in hand. Finally, on October 20, 1552, the walls crumbled. Russian troops stormed the city. The fighting was savage, street by street, house by house. By the end, Kazan was in flames, and Ivan's banner flew over its ruins. The conquest was complete, but the cost was written in blood. Ivan didn't stop there. A few years later, he marched on Astrakhan, another Tatar stronghold further down the Volga. By 1556, Astrakhan too had fallen, giving Ivan control of the entire river from Moscow to the Caspian Sea. Trade routes opened, and Russia's influence suddenly stretched deep into Asia. These victories changed everything. For the first time, Russia wasn't just a regional power, it was an empire in the making. Ivan styled himself as a conqueror blessed by God, the man who had broken the descendants of the Mongol horde. The peasants cheered, the church celebrated, and Ivan basked in the glory. But the conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan wasn't just about glory, it also meant new problems. The conquered peoples were mostly Muslim, not Orthodox. Ivan tried to Christianize them, often by force. Churches rose where mosques once stood, and missionaries followed soldiers. It was victory, but a victory with tension baked in. Still, Ivan used Kazan's victory as his crown jewel. To commemorate it, he ordered the building of St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, with its candy-colored domes that still stun visitors today. Legend says Ivan was so impressed with the architect's work that he had him blinded so no one could ever create anything as beautiful again. Brutal? Yes. Very Ivan, absolutely. With Kazan and Astrakhan under his belt, Ivan had proven he wasn't just Russia's first Tsar by name, he was Tsar in power too. The boy who once feared boyars now commanded an empire. But expansion has a price, and Ivan was about to learn that glory on the battlefield doesn't always mean peace at home. The fall of Kazan in 1552 wasn't just another battle. It was the moment that made Ivan feel unstoppable. For generations, Moscow had fought the Tatars, sometimes winning, often losing. But now, under Ivan's command, the once feared Khanate of Kazan was gone. The young Tsar had finally beaten the shadow of the Mongol horde. When news of Kazan's capture reached Moscow, bells rang for days. Priests led processions, peasants cheered, and the boyars, well, they clapped politely while probably grinding their teeth. Ivan wasn't just a Tsar anymore, he was a holy warrior, a conqueror, whose victory felt blessed by heaven. Of course, Ivan wanted to mark the victory with something unforgettable, so he ordered the construction of a cathedral that would stun anyone who saw it. That cathedral would become the most famous building in Russia, the Cathedral of the Intercession, better known today as St. Basil's. The cathedral's design was unlike anything seen before. Its onion-shaped domes rose like flames frozen in the sky, painted in reds, greens, blues, and gold. Each dome represented one of Ivan's victories around Kazan, making the whole church a giant stone victory banner. Legend has it that when the cathedral was finished, Ivan asked the architect if he could ever build anything so beautiful again. The man said yes. Bad answer. Supposedly Ivan had him blinded so he could never outdo his masterpiece. Whether true or not, the story stuck because it sounded exactly like something Ivan would do. The victory at Kazan also gave Ivan confidence to expand further. For him, Kazan wasn't just a city, it was proof that Russia could grow into a true empire. Step by step, brick by brick, he was building something bigger than anyone had imagined. But the conquest wasn't all glory. The siege had been brutal, and survivors told dark stories of slaughter. Ivan forced Christianity on the conquered, tearing down mosques and replacing them with Orthodox churches. For the Tatars, Kazan was not just lost, it was humiliated. Still, Ivan framed it as divine victory. He commissioned icons showing angels helping Russian soldiers storm Kazan's walls. In these paintings, heaven and Moscow marched side by side. The message was clear. Ivan didn't just win battles, God fought for him. The boyars saw the message too. They knew Ivan's coronation had already raised him above them, but Kazan sealed the deal. Now, opposing Ivan wasn't just politics, it was heresy. The Tsar was no longer a player in their game, he was the game itself, so Kazan became more than a victory, it became Ivan's legend. The cathedral still stands today, its domes like frozen fireworks over Red Square. It is a reminder of the boy who became a conqueror, the Tsar who made Russia expand, and the ruler whose victories were always stained with blood. For a while, life seemed almost good for Ivan. He had victory in Kazan, a new cathedral rising in Moscow, and most importantly, a wife he adored. Anastasia Romanovna wasn't just beautiful, she was kind, steady, and seemed to soften the sharp edges of Ivan's temper. With Anastasia by his side, Ivan was calmer, more thoughtful. He listened more, raged less, and even showed flashes of warmth. For a man shaped by betrayal and cruelty, this was a rare season of peace. It felt like maybe, just maybe, the Tsar had found balance. But history rarely gives rulers long stretches of peace. In 1560, tragedy struck. Anastasia fell ill. At first the court whispered it was nothing serious, just a fever. But days passed and her health worsened. For Ivan, who had already lost so much as a child, the fear was unbearable. When she died, Ivan was devastated. He wept openly, something no one at court had seen before. To him, Anastasia wasn't just his wife, she was his anchor, the one person he truly trusted. And now that anchor was gone. Whispers began almost immediately. Was she poisoned? The boyars had hated Anastasia's influence, and many believed they had murdered her to weaken Ivan. Whether true or not, Ivan believed it. And that belief planted a poisonous seed of paranoia in his heart. Without Anastasia, Ivan's darker side came roaring back. The kindness faded, the rage returned, and the suspicion deepened. To him, the boyars weren't just rivals anymore, they were murderers, traitors, vipers waiting to strike. Even outside the Kremlin, the change was clear. Ivan grew harsher with his subjects, quicker to anger, and colder in his dealings. The people who once saw him as a holy protector now began to whisper about his temper. Fear, once aimed at enemies, started spilling over onto everyone. The church, too, noticed the shift. Where once Ivan prayed for guidance, now he prayed for vengeance. He attended services, yes, but his thoughts seemed less on heaven and more on punishment. It was as if grief had twisted his faith into fuel for wrath. The death of Anastasia marked a turning point. Friends would later say that the Tsar who ruled before her death and the Tsar who ruled after were almost two different men. The first was stern but capable of compassion, the second was consumed by suspicion, cruelty and rage. So in 1560, Russia lost not only its Tsarina, but also its best hope for a kinder Tsar. Ivan's grief turned to fury, and fury turned to paranoia. From this moment on, his reign slid steadily into darkness. Triumph had given way to tragedy, and tragedy had reshaped the man forever. After Anastasia's death, Ivan's grief hardened into rage. To him, the Boyar's were no longer just rivals. They were poisoners, traitors hiding in fur hats. His trust, already fragile, shattered completely. From this point, suspicion wasn't a feeling anymore. It was his guiding principle. In 1564, Ivan did something dramatic. One winter morning, he packed up, left Moscow with his treasures, and rode off to a small town. He left no instructions, no explanations. The capital panicked. Had their Tsar abandoned them? Was Russia leaderless again? From his hideout, Ivan sent letters back to Moscow. In them he raged against the boyars, accusing them of treason and betrayal. But to the common people he wrote like a caring father, promising he still loved them. Clever move, the people began siding with him over the nobles. The boyars, terrified of losing power, begged Ivan to return. But Ivan only agreed on one condition: he would rule with absolute power. No checks, no councils, no interference. The boy who once felt helpless was now rewriting the rules. And so the Oprichniki was born. Ivan divided Russia into two halves. The Zemshnia ruled in the old way, and the Oprichniki, his personal state, under his direct control. In this new system he would be judge, jury and executioner. To enforce his will, Ivan created a new army of loyal enforcers, the Oprichniki. Dressed in black, riding black horses, they carried dog heads and brooms on their saddles, symbols of sniffing out treason and sweeping away enemies. They were more than soldiers, they were Ivan's personal nightmare squad. The Oprichniki spread terror wherever they went. They tortured, executed and confiscated land from nobles accused of treason. Sometimes guilt didn't matter, fear was the point. For Ivan, the boyars were finally feeling what he had felt as a child: helplessness. In Moscow their presence was unmistakable. Black horses clattered across the cobblestones, silent but menacing. When the Oprichniki arrived at your door, you didn't ask why, you just prayed. For Ivan, the Oprichniki wasn't just about power, it was revenge. Every slight from his boyhood, every whisper he'd overheard in the Kremlin halls, every humiliation now burned bright in his memory. The Oprichniki became the instrument of his payback. The Oprichniki turned Russia into a land of fear. People bowed lower, spoke softer, and slept less. For Ivan it was proof that he finally had control. For everyone else, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The Tsar was no longer just ruling, he was unleashed. They came at night, their hoofbeats echoing like thunder through the frozen streets. The people called them the Black Riders. Ivan's Oprichniki, dressed in dark robes and armor, they carried symbols of death, dog heads to sniff out traitors, brooms to sweep away sin. They were less like soldiers and more like ghosts on horseback. Their loyalty was absolute. To join the Oprichniki you had to cut ties with family and swear your soul to the Tsar. Once inside, your only master was Ivan himself. For ordinary Russians that meant the Oprichniki weren't bound by law, only by Ivan's mood. Fear was their greatest weapon. When the Oprichniki entered a town, people didn't resist, they fled. Shops closed, churches locked their doors, and peasants whispered prayers. You never knew if they were there to punish a traitor or invent one. They rode black horses draped in saddles decorated with skulls. Their uniforms were simple but terrifying: black tunics, long beards and cold eyes. In a world of colorful boyar robes and golden church icons, the Oprichniki stood out like shadows carved into the snow. Torture was part of their toolkit. Victims were tied, whipped, burned, and worse. Sometimes the punishments were public, so everyone could see what happened to traitors. Other times people simply vanished into the night, never to be seen again. Their favorite target, the boyars. Ivan had never forgiven them for his childhood, and now he had an army dedicated to their humiliation. Nobles were stripped of land, dragged through the streets, and sometimes executed in ways designed to terrify anyone watching. But the Oprichniki didn't just strike nobles, they punished entire towns. If Ivan suspected a city of betrayal, the Oprichniki descended like wolves. Fires blazed, executions followed, and rivers ran red. The message was simple: loyalty wasn't optional, it was survival. Inside Moscow, the Oprichniki built their own headquarters, a fortress within the city. It was said to feel less like a barracks and more like a monastery of death, where prayers were whispered before executions and black banners hung in the cold air. Ordinary people lived in terror. They told stories of the riders, whispering their names as if speaking too loudly would summon them. Parents warned children obey, or the Black Riders will come. Fear wasn't just a tool, it became a part of daily life. For even the Oprichniki were more than soldiers, they were his revenge, his control, his way of reshaping Russia. But for everyone else, they were a nightmare on horseback. Wherever the Black Riders went, silence, fire and fear followed close behind. By 1570, Ivan's paranoia was fully in control. He heard whispers, whether real or imagined, that the wealthy city of Novgorod planned to betray him and side with Lithuania. To Ivan, this wasn't just treason, it was personal. He saw conspiracy everywhere, and Novgorod became the target of his fury. Ivan marched with thousands of soldiers and his dreaded Oprichniki. On the road to Novgorod, they arrested towns along the way, torturing anyone suspected of sympathy with the enemy. By the time they reached the city gates, fear had already spread like wildfire. When the Tsar entered Novgorod, he was welcomed with bread and salt, the traditional offering of loyalty. But Ivan wasn't interested. In his mind, their smiles were masks hiding betrayal, and so he ordered the purge to begin. The massacre was systematic. Nobles, merchants, priests, anyone suspected of treason were rounded up. They were tortured for confessions, then executed. Entire families disappeared, their homes looted and burned. The city's wealth poured into Ivan's coffers as its people bled. One of the most horrifying scenes took place on the frozen Volkhov River. Victims were tied and thrown into holes cut in the ice, left to drown beneath the current. Whole crowds were driven into the river, their screams muffled by the roar of water and ice. Churches, once safe havens, were stormed by the Oprichniki. Priests were beaten, icons smashed, treasures looted. Even holy places weren't beyond Ivan's wrath. To him, Novgorod's betrayal made them unworthy of God's protection. The violence lasted weeks. By the time Ivan finally pulled back, tens of thousands were dead. Some estimates say 40,000 or more. Novgorod, once one of Russia's most prosperous cities, was left broken, its people scattered, its wealth gone, its soul crushed. And yet Ivan showed no regret. To him this was justice. He believed he had uncovered treason, punished it thoroughly, and proven that betrayal against the Tsar meant annihilation. The boy who once felt powerless now wielded terror like a weapon forged in fire. For the survivors, fear lingered long after the soldiers left. Mothers hushed children with whispers of Ivan's name, merchants carried their trade in silence, and priests prayed quietly behind half-empty churches. Novgorod never fully recovered. The Novgorod Massacre became one of Ivan's most infamous crimes. It showed Russia that loyalty wasn't enough. You had to prove it, over and over, or risk destruction. Ivan the Terrible wasn't just a nickname anymore. He was earning it, one massacre at a time. For all his cruelty at home, Ivan still cared deeply about how the outside world saw him. He wanted Russia to be respected in Europe, not just as some frozen backwater, but as a powerful empire ruled by a true Tsar. And so Ivan began writing letters abroad. One of his most famous correspondents was Queen Elizabeth I of England. Imagine it, Russia's most terrifying ruler exchanging polite, flowery letters with England's sharp-tongued virgin queen. Their relationship was odd, part diplomacy, part friendship, maybe even part something more. In his letters, Ivan could be surprisingly charming. He flattered Elizabeth, hinted at trade opportunities, and even suggested marriage alliances. Yes, you heard that right. The terrifying Tsar once tried to angle for the hand of the Queen of England. Elizabeth, of course, wasn't interested in marrying Ivan, but she was interested in trade. Through his diplomacy, Ivan opened a trading link with England via the White Sea, giving Russia access to Western goods and technology. It was one of his smarter moves. But diplomacy wasn't just business for Ivan, it was also paranoia on paper. He begged Elizabeth for asylum, saying that if his boyars ever overthrew him, he might need a safe place to live in England. Imagine that, the man who terrified Russia asking for a spare room in London. While writing flowery letters abroad, Ivan was still unleashing terror at home. One day he charmed Elizabeth, the next he drowned priests in Novgorod. The contradiction baffled foreign rulers. Was Ivan a brilliant statesman or a mad tyrant? The truth was, he was both. Ivan also toyed with marriage alliances across Europe. He proposed to noble women from Poland, Sweden, and even the Holy Roman Empire. Some refused politely, others flat out panicked. After all, who wanted to be Tsarina when the last one had likely been poisoned? At times, Ivan's letters veered into rants. He scolded Elizabeth for not treating him as an equal, accused his own subjects of treason, and often reminded everyone that he ruled by God's will. His pen was as sharp as his sword, and just as unpredictable. To foreign eyes, Ivan was a puzzle. Some saw him as a bold reformer who opened Russia to Europe. Others saw him as a mad tyrant who butchered his own people. The truth was, both sides were right. Ivan's genius and madness were woven together like threads in the same fur cloak. In the end, Ivan's diplomacy showed the world a strange contrast. He was a man who dreamed of Western alliances, yet ruled with medieval cruelty. A Tsar who asked for Elizabeth's friendship while torturing his nobles. Diplomacy and madness weren't separate for Ivan, they were two sides of the same crown. After Kazan and Astrakhan, Ivan's eyes turned west. Russia was landlocked with no easy way to trade with Europe by sea. He wanted the Baltic coast, a gateway to wealth and influence. The problem? The land belonged to the Livonian Order, a fading crusader state. To Ivan they looked like an easy target. In 1558, Ivan launched the Livonian War. At first things looked great. Russian armies stormed across the region, capturing castles and towns. Ivan celebrated, seeing himself not just as Tsar of Russia, but as a future ruler of the Baltic seas. But Ivan underestimated his enemies. The Livonian Order may have been weak, but it had powerful friends. Soon Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden joined the fight. What started as a quick grab for the coast turned into a long, grinding war against nearly all of Russia's neighbors. At first, Russian victories continued, cities fell, fortresses crumbled, and Ivan's banners spread across Livonia. But every new gain stretched supply lines thinner, and behind every fortress taken, another enemy army gathered. The war dragged on for years. Soldiers starved, peasants fled burned villages, and resources drained away. Ivan taxed heavily, confiscated land, and relied more and more on his Oprichniki. The Livonian War wasn't just fought on battlefields, it was fought in the empty bellies of Russian peasants. By the 1560s, the tide began turning against Russia. The Polish king, Stephen Bathory, was a skilled commander who drove the Russians back. Sweden also struck hard, seizing key fortresses. What Ivan thought would be a quick victory was becoming a humiliating stalemate. Ivan grew desperate. He begged Elizabeth I of England for an alliance, promising trade and friendship. She sent polite words but no army. Once again, Ivan learned that his letters carried less weight than his enemies' swords. As the war dragged on, Ivan's temper boiled over. He blamed boyars for defeats, accusing generals of treason. Executions became common. The battlefield was bloody, but the Kremlin was almost worse. Terror ruled every hall. By the 1570s, the war was draining Russia dry. Towns were in ruins, famine spread, and the once mighty armies were stretched to the breaking point. Instead of opening Russia to Europe, the Livonian War was closing the country in, leaving it isolated and exhausted. The Livonian War would drag on for 24 long years, ending in disaster for Ivan. He gained nothing permanent, lost thousands of lives, and ruined Russia's economy. What began as a dream of empire became a costly lesson. Even the most terrible Tsar couldn't conquer all. By the mid-1560s, Ivan was seething. The war dragged on, boyar walls whispered behind his back, and his paranoia burned hotter than ever. He saw betrayal everywhere, in the army, in the Kremlin, even in the church. Then, in 1564, he stunned the world with a move no one saw coming. He quit. He left Moscow suddenly, taking his family, treasures, and loyal guards with him. No speeches, no explanations. The Kremlin was silent. It was as if Russia had lost its Tsar overnight. Panic swept the city like wildfire. From his hideaway in the town of Alexandrov, Ivan sent letters back to Moscow. In them he accused the boyars and church leaders of treason, corruption, and betrayal. To the common people, though, his tone was softer. He reassured them that he still loved them. Clever, right? Divide and conquer, even from afar. The boyars panicked. Without Ivan, Russia could collapse. Enemies circled the borders, famine gnawed at the countryside, and no one wanted to take the throne. They begged Ivan to return, promising loyalty. The Tsar had them right where he wanted them. When he finally agreed to return, Ivan did so on his own terms. He demanded absolute authority, power to punish anyone, confiscate land, and rule without interference. Shockingly, the boyars agreed. They had no choice. Russia without Ivan felt scarier than Russia with him. This stunt wasn't abdication, it was theater. Ivan had staged the greatest disappearing act in Russian history, only to come back stronger than before. Now his power was not just great, it was unquestioned. The people, oddly enough, supported him. To peasants, Ivan looked like a Tsar who fought corrupt nobles on their behalf. Never mind the terror squads and executions, he painted himself as a protector, and they believed it, but the boyars knew the truth. Ivan's return meant the end of their influence. From now on, speaking against him wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. His fake abdication had turned the game upside down, and he was the only player left. It was one of Ivan's most cunning moves. By pretending to walk away, he proved how indispensable he was. By returning on his own terms, he made sure no one would ever question his authority again, so the Tsar who quit never really quit at all. Instead, he returned as something even darker, a ruler unbound by law, fear, or restraint. Ivan had outplayed his enemies, and the cost would soon be paid in blood. With absolute power in his hands, Ivan's paranoia only grew sharper. Every whisper in a hallway, every glance from a noble, every rumor from the streets, he twisted into proof of betrayal. He didn't just rule Russia, he ruled his own imagination, and it was full of enemies. Nights were restless for the Tsar. He claimed to see omens in dreams, flashes of betrayal, visions of fire, and saints warning him of plots. Instead of calming him, religion now fed his fears. Was it God speaking, or his own madness? Even Ivan couldn't tell anymore. In the Kremlin, torture chambers grew busier. Ivan ordered confessions from boyars, priests, even servants. If someone broke under questioning, he took it as proof of guilt. If they stayed silent, well, that was proof too. For Ivan, innocence no longer existed. His paranoia wasn't just about politics, it was personal. He suspected even friends and family. No one was safe from his suspicion. One day, Ivan might shower someone with gifts. The next, he might accuse them of treason and send them to the axe. Alcohol and illness only deepened his mood swings. Some nights he drank heavily, raging through the halls. Other nights he sat in silence, staring into nothing for hours. Courtiers tiptoed around him, never knowing if the Tsar that day would be merciful or monstrous. Superstition wrapped tighter around him. He trusted astrologers, read omens in the stars, and feared witches in the forests. He prayed constantly, yet seemed convinced God was as angry as he was. His crown weighed heavy, not just with gold, but with ghosts. Ordinary Russians began to whisper that their Tsar was cursed. His victories had brought glory, yes, but his wrath brought famine, fire, and endless executions. To them, Ivan wasn't just a ruler, he was a storm that never ended. Even his Oprichniki, once so loyal, grew uneasy. Some feared his rage might turn on them next, others tried to outdo each other in cruelty just to stay in his good graces. The cycle fed itself, fear birthing more fear, blood feeding more blood. To outsiders, Ivan looked less like a ruler and more like a man consumed by his own demons. Diplomats described him as brilliant, one moment, unhinged the next. Was he still the boy who once read books alone in the Kremlin, or had that boy been lost long ago? By the late 1560s, Ivan's paranoia had become Russia's reality. Every decision, every law, every punishment was shaped by the demons in his mind. The Tsar who once dreamed of empire was now fighting shadows and dragging his whole nation into the darkness with him. For all his power, Ivan still craved what he had always been denied: trust and family. His sons were supposed to be his legacy, the future of Russia. But even here, his paranoia and temper began to tear everything apart. His eldest son, Ivanovich, was strong, intelligent, and loyal. Many believed he could one day be a great Tsar, but that only made the elder Ivan's paranoia worse. The closer his son grew to power, the more suspicious the father became. Accounts differ, but the story goes that Ivan quarreled with his son after striking his pregnant daughter-in-law in a fit of rage. His son confronted him, furious. Words turned to shouts, and shouts turned into violence. In a moment of fury, Ivan raised his staff and struck his son. The blow landed on the young man's temple. Silence fell, broken only by a cry of pain. Blood spilled across the floor. The Tsar froze, realizing he had gone too far. Ivan Ivanovich lay dying. His father, the terrible Tsar, fell to his knees, clutching him, sobbing, begging forgiveness. The same man who had ordered thousands of executions now wept over the life he had taken with his own hands. The image of Ivan holding his dying son became one of the most famous in Russian history. Centuries later, it would be captured in Ilya Repin's painting, forever cementing the moment as a symbol of rage, regret, and tragedy. The death shattered Ivan. He had destroyed not just his heir but his own future. His second son Fyodor was weak and sickly, not fit to rule. With one blow, Ivan had doomed Russia to chaos. The court was silent after the tragedy. No one dared speak against the Tsar, but everyone knew what it meant. The dynasty's strongest heir was gone, killed by his own father's hand. It was a wound that time could never heal. For the Russian people, the story spread like wildfire. If Ivan was feared before, now he seemed cursed. The Tsar who could not control his temper had lost control of his family, and of the very future of his empire. The death of Ivan's heir was more than a family tragedy, it was a national disaster. With his son gone, Russia's path would spiral toward the time of troubles. The terrible Tsar had destroyed the very thing he sought to protect, his own dynasty. By the late 1570s, Ivan was a man both feared and broken. He had expanded Russia's borders, But at home the land was weary. Famine, war, and terror had left fields empty and villages silent. The glory of Kazan seemed like a distant memory. Ivan himself was aging fast. Illness gnawed at him, pain in his joints, weakness in his body. He drank heavily, prayed constantly, and relied on strange remedies. Doctors gave him potions that did little more than poison him slowly. Superstition replaced reason. Ivan listened to astrologers and sorcerers, looking for omens in the stars. He carried relics into battle and obsessed over holy visions. To him, every illness, every defeat was part of a cosmic war between God and demons, with himself caught in the middle. But while Ivan prayed for signs, his people prayed for food. Famine swept through the land, worsened by the endless wars and Oprichniki seizures. Hungry peasants wandered the roads, begging for bread, while tax collectors demanded coin they didn't have. The church, once his ally, grew uneasy. Priests whispered that Ivan's cruelty had gone too far. Some even suggested his victories were curses, not blessings, but few dared say it aloud. Challenging Ivan was still a death sentence. Russia itself seemed cursed. The Livonian War dragged on with no end. The Oprichniki continued their terror, and even the weather turned against the land. Harsh winters, failed harvests, and disease followed one after another, piling suffering upon suffering. Ivan's reputation abroad grew darker. To Europe he was no longer a promising young Tsar, but a mad tyrant who drowned his own cities in blood. Diplomats called him cruel, unpredictable, dangerous. Yet oddly, they also respected his power because no one could deny he ruled absolutely. At home his court lived in constant dread. One moment Ivan handed out gifts, the next he demanded executions. Boyabows bowed lower than ever, their smiles tight, their hands trembling as they swore loyalty. They knew one mistake could cost everything. Even Ivan seemed to know his legacy would be written in blood. He gave lavish donations to churches, hoping prayers might cleanse his sins. But no matter how much gold he gave, he couldn't erase the screams that haunted his memory. By the end of his reign, Ivan had built an empire, but at a terrible cost. Russia was larger, yes, but poorer, weaker, and scarred. His name, Grozny, the formidable, the terrible, fit perfectly. His legacy wasn't just land and cathedrals, it was a kingdom built on fear, forged in fire, and stained forever with blood. By the early 1580s, Ivan was a shadow of his former self. Once fierce and unstoppable, he now shuffled through the Kremlin halls, hunched with age and sickness. The fire was still in his eyes, but his body betrayed him. His health was failing. Gout twisted his legs, pain racked his body, and his mind swung between lucidity and madness. He blamed poison, sorcery, even demons. But the truth was simple. The terrible Tsar was wearing out. Despite his frailty, Ivan remained obsessed with omens. He studied astrology, demanded prophecies, and listened to whispers from mystics. He feared death, yet seemed determined to stare it in the face. In his final years, Ivan prepared for death the way he prepared for war, with suspicion. He drew up wills, changed them, rewrote them again. He hoarded treasures, fearing boyars would steal them. Trust even at the end was impossible. On March 18, 1584, Ivan sat down to play a game of chess. The board was laid out, the pieces arranged, the Tsar's hand resting on a pawn. Then, suddenly, he collapsed forward. The terrible Tsar had played his final move. Courtiers rushed to his side, but it was too late. The man who had ruled with fire and fear was gone. A hush fell over the Kremlin, as if the walls themselves were stunned that Ivan's reign had ended. The official cause was said to be a stroke, though whispers of poison lingered. For a man who trusted no one, death by betrayal almost seemed fitting. But whether natural or not, Ivan was gone, and Russia was left trembling. His body was laid in the Archangel Cathedral within the Kremlin. Mourners came, but many wept with relief as much as grief. The terrible Tsar was finally still, but his shadow stretched over everyone left behind. With Ivan gone, his weak son Fyodor inherited the throne. Everyone knew he could not match his father's strength. The time of troubles was approaching, and it all began with that final breath at the chessboard. Ivan's death ended a reign of fire, but not the fear. His people remembered the terror, the massacres, the Black Riders, yet they also remembered the cathedrals, the victories, and the empire he had forged. In the end, the terrible Tsar left behind a Russia both stronger and scarred forever. Ivan the Terrible was gone, but his shadow lingered. Russia was larger, stronger, and more centralized than ever before, yet it was also scarred, its people exhausted, its nobility broken, its fields burned. His reign left both a throne and a wound. To some, Ivan was a visionary. He expanded Russia eastward, created its first standing army, and built cathedrals that still stand today. He turned Moscow into the beating heart of an empire. Without him, Russia might never have become the giant it is. But to others, he was a tyrant. The Oprichniki, the massacres, the paranoia, these weren't signs of greatness but madness. His rule was a reign of terror, where fear was more common than bread, and trust was impossible. Even his name carried weight. In Russian, Grozny means not just terrible, but formidable, fearsome, awe-inspiring. It was a name that fit perfectly. Ivan was all of those things, often at once. His legacy shaped the future of Russia. Later Tsars, from Peter the Great to Catherine the Great, built on the foundations Ivan had laid. But they also feared becoming like him. Brilliant, yes, but also brutal, cursed and consumed by paranoia. For ordinary Russians, Ivan became a figure of folklore. Some tales painted him as a saint who defended the Orthodox faith. Others made him into a monster who drank blood and spoke with demons. History blurred into legend. Artists and writers kept his memory alive. Painters showed his grief, poets described his fury, and storytellers whispered about his cruelty. Ivan became less of a man and more of a symbol, the eternal warning of what happens when fear rules. Modern historians still debate him. Was Ivan a necessary strongman who held Russia together, or a paranoid tyrant who nearly destroyed it? The answer, as always, lies somewhere in between. He was both builder and destroyer. In the end, Ivan's reign left Russia bigger but bruised, centralized but traumatized. His dynasty ended soon after his death, plunging the nation into the time of troubles. It was as if his spirit refused to leave, dragging the country down even after his last breath. So Ivan remains, centuries later, a figure both feared and fascinating. A Tsar who prayed like a saint and killed like a demon. A ruler who dreamed of empire but left his people in terror. His throne may be empty, but his shadow still sits across Russian history. I hoped you enjoyed this story of Ivan the Terrible. Please give the video a like and subscribe if you want more of these stories from ancient history.